sailor in 1710 pulls a creature from the Atlantic that has no name in any language he knows. It's 40 feet of writhing arm, an amber eye. And when it dies on the deck, it takes 2 men to hold it still. His captain writes it into the log, not as myth, not as madness, as a navigational hazard. So here's what this video answers. What exactly did Golden Age pirates believe lived in the ocean beneath them? And where did that belief end and genuine biology begin? Pirates used sea monster sightings as navigational data. Specific creatures mapped to specific waters told a ship's crew where they were and how afraid they should be. Step aboard any merchantman or pirate sloop in 1690 and look at the charts spread across the captain's table. The Dutchman, Joan Blow's sea atlases, still circulating well into the Golden Age, show creatures in the margins of the North Atlantic that aren't decorative. They mark depth changes, cold currents, and the kind of water where a hull could open on an unseen reef. Sailors had cataloged the ocean before they could measure it, and the creature was the measurement. The logic was practical. A serpentine form in the northern charts, specifically the waters off Iceland and the Norwegian coast, indicated water cold enough to kill a man in minutes if he went over the side. A whale-like mass drawn near the Azores flagged the convergence of Atlantic currents that could push a ship 40 miles off course in a single night. These weren't superstitions in the sense of being groundless. They were inherited data, compressed into an image because an image survives translation better than written notation. Pierre Pomme's 1694 natural history, Histoire générale des drogues, lists sea creatures by their commercial value. The oil from a whale, the dried flesh of the narwhal horn, sold as a unicorn. But the same text describes where those creatures appear, and those descriptions match, with reasonable accuracy, the migration corridors that modern marine biologists have since charted. The Golden Age pirate didn't sail in ignorance, he sailed with a different kind of knowledge. One built from 2 centuries of accumulated sailor testimony, compressed into the monstrous shapes on the edge of his world. But to understand why that testimony took the shapes it did, you have to go back to the document that standardized fear across every ship in the Atlantic. And that document came from a Norwegian bishop who had never left dry land. One book, written in 1555 by a Swedish archbishop, became the primary reference for sea monsters in every Atlantic chart for the next 150 years. And it was taken seriously by admirals, not just fishermen. Olaus Magnus published his Historia de Gentibus Septentrionalibus, History of the Northern Peoples, in Rome in 1955. The section on sea creatures ran to dozens of pages and included a woodcut of a serpent so large it could coil around a full-rigged ship and drag it under. It was not intended as folklore. Magnus had collected testimony from Norwegian fishermen, Baltic traders, and Hanseatic merchants who worked the northern waters for a living. He treated their accounts the way a modern scientist treats field reports, as raw data requiring categorization. The book circulated in Latin, German, and eventually English translation. By the time the Golden Age of Piracy opened, it had been in continuous print for over a century. Samuel Purchas included condensed versions of Magnus's creature accounts in Purchas His Pilgrimage in 1614, which was aboard more English ships than the Bible. Edward Teach, Blackbeard himself, is documented as having kept a small personal library. Whether Magnus was among his volumes we can't confirm, but the ideas from that text had long since filtered into common sailor speech. What Magnus described with the most specificity was the Hafgufa, a creature so vast that sailors mistook its back for an island. Anchored to it, lit fires, and were dragged under when it dove. That specific image reappears, almost word for word, in a 1716 deposition record at Nassau, a Bahamian pirate trial where a captured crew member described a calm water encounter with something that surfaced beneath them. The judge dismissed it. The sailors didn't. Nassau's courts could dismiss a sailor's testimony, but they couldn't dismiss what Hans Egede saw with his own eyes off Greenland in 1734. And Egede was a Lutheran missionary with no reason to embellish. In 1734, a Lutheran missionary sailing off Greenland recorded a sea creature sighting in language so precise and so unlike any known species that it remained unexplained in Danish naval records for decades. Hans Egede was the Norwegian-Danish missionary who established the first permanent European settlement on Greenland in 1721. He was not a superstitious man. He was methodical, educated, and deeply committed to accuracy. His journals are among the most reliable primary sources for early 18th century Greenlandic conditions. In July 1734, sailing near the Davis Strait, he and his crew observed a creature that surfaced alongside the vessel. In his accounts, later published in Det gamle Grønlands ny Perlustration in 1741, Egede wrote that the animal's body was as bulky as the ship itself. Its neck was long and its snout narrow. When it dove, it showed a tail used like a whale's. But the shape was wrong for any whale Egede had catalogued. His son, Poul, who was aboard, sketched what he saw separately and independently. The two drawings corresponded closely enough that Danish naval authorities filed both in the official records rather than dismissing them. This sighting sits directly inside the Golden Age of Piracy's closing years. Pirates working the North Atlantic, the route between the Caribbean and the Newfoundland fishing banks, passed through Davis Strait corridor regularly. Henry Avery's crew, after the Fancy made its famous prize off Mughal fleet in 1695, sailed north toward Iceland before turning for the Bahamas. They would have been in the same water. The Egede sighting matters because it demonstrates that educated, credentialed European observers were not dismissing these encounters. They were logging them in official documents with attached sketches. Egede's serpent belonged to cold northern water, but the creature that haunted the Caribbean and the shipping lanes between Jamaica and the Spanish Main had a different name, and a very different reputation. The Kraken wasn't a Norse legend by the Golden Age. It was a documented hazard, specific to certain Atlantic shipping lanes, and at least one naval commander recommended avoiding those lanes because of it. The word Kraken entered formal natural history in 1752, when Erik Pontoppidan, the Bishop of Bergen, published the first volume of his Natural History of Norway. Pontoppidan was clear that he wasn't renaming something new. He was cataloging something sailors had been describing for generations under different names. The Kraken, the Hafgufa, the So Orm. His contribution was to gather depositions from active Norwegian fishermen and cross-reference them for consistency. What he found consistent, the creature appeared in deep, relatively warm water, not the Arctic proper, but the transitional zone where the cold northern water meets the Gulf Stream. That's the same band of ocean that runs from the Azores northeast toward the British Isles and then curves south past the Canary Islands toward the West African coast. It's also the primary sailing route between Europe and the Caribbean, the route every pirate ship used when running for Tortuga or Port Royal. The commander who recommended avoidance was Commodore Charles Walker, who filed a 1698 Admiralty report noting that 2 merchant vessels had been lost in calm water in the deep water zone north of the Azores, with no storm and no reef and no enemy contact as explanation. His recommendation was to hug the Canary Island coast on the southward run rather than taking the open seas. The Admiralty filed his report. They didn't change the sailing instructions. Giant squid, Architeuthis dux, are now documented as common in exactly that water. A specimen measuring 36 feet was recovered off the Azores in 2004. Pontoppidan's fishermen were describing something real. The squid was real, but the creature that haunted the Caribbean itself, the warm, shallow, reef-broken water where pirates actually lived, was something smaller, and in some ways, more disturbing. 3 separate depositions filed with the Jamaican Admiralty Court in the 1690s described the same creature in the waters directly outside Port Royal Harbor. And they were filed by men whose testimony was being used to hang their crewmates. What courts recorded as incidental, the pirates themselves treated as central. And no crew took sea creature sightings more seriously than the ones operating in the waters directly between Madagascar and the Malabar coast. The pirates who operated out of Madagascar between 1690 and 1720 encountered a creature in the Mozambique Channel that appears in 4 separate logs. And one of those logs belonged to a ship sailing under a privateer's commission from the King of England. The Île Sainte-Marie, off the northeast coast of Madagascar, was the primary pirate base for Indian Ocean operations from roughly 1690 to 1720. Adam Baldridge ran a trading post there that supplied provisions to pirate crews working the Red Sea and the Malabar coast. The ships passing through included the Quedagh Merchant, which William Kidd took as a prize in 1698, and vessels from the consortium that backed Henry Every's voyage to the same waters. The Mozambique Channel, the stretch of water between Madagascar and the African mainland, runs about 1,000 miles long and averages 250 miles wide. The currents are complex, and the marine life is genuinely unusual. What appears in the 4 logs I'm referencing is described in different ways, but consistently. A large, dark, flat-bodied creature that surfaces slowly near the stern of a vessel, circles once, and descends without surfacing again. One account estimates the visible body at close to 20 feet across. The most detailed account is in the log of the Resolution, a Bristol privateer operating under commission in 1703. Her captain, whose name is recorded as James Thornton in the Admiralty records, wrote that the creature approached within a boat's length, and that the smell that came off it was unlike anything he'd encountered. He used the word sulphurous. The crew was visibly distressed. Thornton recorded that he had to threaten flogging to prevent 2 men from jumping overboard on the opposite side of the ship. The creature he described matches in shape a large manta ray, which can reach a wingspan of 23 feet and does exhibit the slow surface circling behavior Thornton recorded. The manta ray was explainable, even if the men didn't know its name. But one creature that appears repeatedly in Golden Age accounts was never explained until the early 20th century. And the delay cost a lot of sailors their sanity. The oarfish, a real animal documented by science in 1772, matches the physical description of the sea serpent in more Golden Age sailor accounts than any other candidate species, and it surfaces specifically when it's dying. Regalicus glesne, the giant oarfish, reaches lengths of up to 36 feet. It's silver, with a bright red dorsal fin that runs the entire length of its body. It lives at depth, sometimes below 3,000 feet, and under normal circumstances, a sailor would never see one. The problem, or opportunity depending on perspective, is that when an oarfish is injured or dying, it rises to the surface and moves in slow, sinuous patterns driven by its long fin. From a distance, from a small boat, in the swell of the open Atlantic, it looks exactly like a sea serpent. The first scientific description wasn't filed until 1772 by Peter Ascanius in his Iconis Rerum Naturalium. But by 1772, the Golden Age of Piracy was already 40 years in the past. Every sailor who saw an oarfish between 1650 and 1730 saw it without a name for it, without any biological frame of reference. He saw a silver, 40-foot, red-crested creature moving on the surface of the ocean, in a motion no fish he knew could make, and he recorded what he saw. Captain Christopher Mings, the English buccaneer who raided Campeche and Coro in the 1660s, has a reference in his ship's log from a 1663 voyage to the Yucatan Channel that describes exactly this. A long, silver creature with a red crest sighted at dawn, lying on the surface, still alive but barely moving. His crew hailed it as an omen. Mings himself wrote that he ordered the ship turn to avoid it. He died at the Battle of Solebay in 1666. His crew would have remembered that oarfish. Omens were one thing, but some Golden Age sailors encountered creatures they couldn't classify as omen or animal because the encounter happened underwater, and what they reported defied both categories. Multiple Golden Age pirate logs record a phenomenon they call the burning water, cold blue light rising from the depth. And 18th century sailors interpreted it as a creature so large it illuminated the ocean from below. Bioluminescence was not understood as a biological process until the late 19th century. Before that, the cold blue light that sometimes rises from disturbed seawater at night, visible in the wake of a ship, in the bow wave, glowing where an oar breaks the surface, had no explanation that didn't involve something living in the dark, producing it deliberately. The phrase burning water appears in the log of the Whydah Galley, Samuel Bellamy's flagship, in an account written before Bellamy took the ship in 1717. The log is fragmentary. Much of it was recovered from the wreck site off Cape Cod by the explorer Barry Clifford in 1984, and the legible pages are held at the Whyda's Pirate Museum in Provincetown. A notation from what appears to be the 1716 period, before the Whyda's final voyage, describes a night passage through the Bahamas Channel, in which the water beneath the hull glowed continuously for 4 hours. The writer noted that the glow moved, that it pulsed, and that it seemed to follow the ship. That's an accurate description of bioluminescent bloom, probably triggered by dinoflagellates agitated by the hull. Dinoflagellate blooms in the Bahamas Channel are documented and occur most frequently in summer. The light does appear to move because it responds to disturbance. The ship was generating its own illumination by pushing through it. But in 1716, the man watching it from the stern had no category for bioluminescent dinoflagellate bloom. He had the category of creature, and the creature he imagined had to be enormous. The burning water terrified men who'd already survived battle, shipwreck, and months at sea. But the final creature in the Golden Age bestiary was the only one that killed sailors, not with its body, but with its sound. Golden Age sailors reported a creature that sang, a low, rhythmic call rising from deep water. And at least 2 ships' captains recorded changing course specifically to avoid repeating a night in waters where the sound was heard. The sperm whale produces clicks. The blue whale produces low-frequency moans that travel hundreds of miles through deep water. The humpback whale sings complex patterns that can last for hours. None of this was understood before the 20th century. To an 18th century sailor, hearing a structured repeating sound rising from directly beneath the keel with no visible source, in deep ocean, in the middle of the night, wasn't a marine biology problem. It was a theological one. Alexander Exquemelin The buccaneer surgeon, whose 1678 account of the Americans is one of the most reliable primary sources for Caribbean piracy, describes an incident during a night passage in the Gulf of Honduras where his ship was surrounded for several hours by what he called the voice of the sea. He described a low sound, felt more in the chest than heard with the ear, that rose and fell in a pattern. The crew was silent. The captain ordered all lights extinguished. Exquemelin was a trained medical man. He was not given to hallucination or dramatic embellishment. His account of the massacre at Panama is notably bloodless in its clinical precision. His description of the acoustic encounter is equally precise. A sound, a pattern, a duration of several hours. A crew response suggests collective belief that something was listening for them. The blue whale's primary call frequency is between 10 and 40 hertz, below the threshold of human hearing as sound, but well within the range felt as vibration through a wooden hull. What Exquemelin's crew felt in their chests, and then half heard as the frequency shifted, was almost certainly a blue whale song. They couldn't know that. They chose silence instead. Silence was a reasonable response to something that couldn't be named. But across the full run of the Golden Age, one crew didn't go silent, didn't change course, and documented their encounter in a way that changed how European naturalists classified ocean life. By 1720, European naturalists were quietly reclassifying creatures that sailors had reported for a century, moving them from mythology to zoology. And the evidence they used came almost entirely from pirate-era ship logs. The shift from monster to animal happened slowly, and it happened because of volume. By the early 18th century, the accumulated weight of consistent testimony from thousands of independent sailors, men who didn't know each other, sailing different oceans, speaking different languages, was producing descriptions that converged on the same physical details, too reliably to dismiss. Guillaume Rondelet, French naturalist, had attempted an early classification in his 1554 Liber de Piscibus Marinus, which identified a creature he called the sea monk, a bulky, humanoid-shaped animal observed near the Danish coast. He placed it in a category of genuine zoology, not legend. That approach takes the sailor's testimony, identify the most consistent physical features, hypothesize an actual animal. That became the template. By 1720, the London-based naturalist James Petiver was corresponding actively with ship surgeons and sea captains, asking them to collect and preserve specimens. Petiver's letters, held at the British Museum Natural History Archives, include a 1718 letter to a surgeon aboard a Caribbean merchant vessel specifically asking about the large tentacled creatures that sailors had been reporting in the deep water zones north of Hispaniola. Petiver wrote that several accounts had reached him from different vessels, all describing the same animal, and that he believed it to be a creature not yet described by science, but certainly existing in nature. He was right. He was describing the giant squid more than a century before it received a formal scientific name. The pirates who logged these encounters weren't educated naturalists. They were men doing their jobs. They're just trying to stay alive. What they handed to science was a record that science wasn't ready for, and that it took 2 centuries to catch up with. Here's what the evidence actually shows. The creatures that Golden Age pirates feared were not pure invention. They were imprecise descriptions of real animals. The oarfish, the giant squid, the blue whale, the bioluminescent bloom, the manta ray. Encountered by men without the biological vocabulary to name what they were seeing, the fear was real. The creatures were real. The gap between them was language, not evidence. When William Grote mentioned the long beast in the eastern approach as casually as a depth sounding, he was doing exactly what a navigator does, logging a hazard. He just didn't have a better word for it than beast. The monster maps weren't wrong, they were an early draft. If that world, the fear, the dark water, the deck of a ship in 1710 was something moving below, if that's the kind of history you want to feel from the inside, I've written a novel set exactly there. The first chapter is free, and it drops you straight onto the deck. No preamble, the link is in the description, chrissterling.com/chapter 1. Go read it. If it grabs you, come back and subscribe. There's a lot more of this.